Hey guys, what's up? MJW006 back with part 2 of the newest Heads Up Sit and Go series we've got for you. And today we're going to do a video basically on some of the common plays made in the mid stakes. As we discussed last week, when we're talking about some common lines, some value betting spots, value betting and thinking about what our best rate of value is. These are all the small nuances which really become important when you start coming through the mid stakes and you start trying to improve your game. I think you can beat the low stakes at a pretty fair clip by playing reasonably solidly and doing the fundamentals well. And that's just the grounding for your poker framework in general. When you start coming through the mid stakes, in order to actually get through the mid stakes, I think we need to start thinking about some of these other elements, such as value betting thin, our bet sizing on certain streets, and just stopping and thinking about what our best straight of value is, or how many streets of value we're going to get in certain places. What I've got today is a pre-recorded video of a couple of games that I played a couple of nights ago, where basically I think that the play that I actually got together here is actually pretty indicative of what it goes on in the mid stakes. And by the mid stakes, I mean basically the $30 to the $100 level. In these levels, the play is going to be relatively similar. I think the biggest challenge for a lot of people is the mental jump of the swings, because in the low stakes, I think you can win at a pretty high win rate and the variance isn't all that significant. But as you start coming up through the mid stakes, that variance will start to hit you. Mentally, for some people, I think jumping up, especially people who have been building their roll up from $100 or $200, and then all of a sudden it becomes possible to be dropping, $500 to $1,000 in a session, all of a sudden it starts to become challenging mentally. I think the $30 and the $50 level, I think it's important that people spend a decent amount of time there, really to just get their head around the nature of the swings, to build their bankroll, because the games are still relatively soft there. And that's before they do start moving up to the $100 games and beyond, obviously, because then the variance becomes higher and you do start to experience these mental swings. So you're going to have to get your head around just how significant the variance actually is in heads up sit and goes. But for now, we're just going to get rolling with this. I've only got the one table here at the moment. Another table will pop up in just a second. Had to wait a little while for some action here. So we start off with our Queen 10. We're going to start off by opening 3x, and we're just going to, as I've discussed in the previous series, we're really just going to try to feel our opponent out in the early stages and see how they respond to certain actions and see how they're going to play in general. So see if we can find a category that we can place them in, whether that be loose aggressive or tight passive, as we've discussed in previous series. All right. So nice to get aces early. And it's going to give us a chance to 3-bet and see how they respond to the 3-bet. Check away the King 10 on the right-hand side, and I just lead. In this spot, I think it's best to just barrel off. And the reason is basically on this flop texture here, once we get called once, typically it's going to be a drawing hand or worse kings in his range. I think that we can pretty clearly bet the flop and turn here. I think that's a pretty easy flop and turn bet. When we get to the river and the main draw misses, even though there's not a lot of significant draws there, you've got hands like Jack 10, Queen Jack, 10 8, a lot of straight draws which are floating here on this board. And then a lot of them are still going to be likely in this instance to actually call another bet here. When we get to the river and them draws actually miss, it's pretty close between actually just firing off the third barrel and giving them an opportunity to bluff. What I actually elected to do, and I think that I was actually wrong in this situation, because even though there's a lot of them missed draws now, there's also a lot of hands which are calling down, like worse kings, 9x, 7x. The thing that I was thinking at the time, though, I wasn't 100% sure if we were going to get called on 3 streets by 9x or 7x. So if we are actually going to get called by them hands, then we're going to be better off just obviously firing the third barrel. We're always getting called by King X here, but there's not that many worse King X either, because King 9, King 7, King 4, King 3 obviously better. So it only leaves King 8, King 6, King 5, and King Deuce basically left. And I do kind of expect that we get raised on the flop in some cases by King X. So I think it was relatively close. I may have been better just firing off another barrel, given that he's an unknown, and see if we can get called by 9x, 7x, or one of them weaker kings. As it is, I ended up checking here, and I think he ends up checking it back, which he does. So we have 3-bet on the left, which is an easy fold. So not much going on so far. We'll just keep raising here on the left-hand side. King Deuce is a raise. On the left, pretty wet board. However, I still typically go ahead and c-bet this early on in a match. I didn't in this case, but I do like to test the waters and see how they're going to respond to consistent 3-bets and things like that, because one of the most exploitable tendencies that some players display is that they just fold way too much to c-bets regardless of the texture. So early on, typically I'll go ahead and c-bet. In that case, I think I had a gut shot, so I may have checked it back for that reason. I'm not 100% sure. It's a couple of times we've been 3-bet on the left-hand table. We'll just keep an eye on that. Flat the 7s. It's a pretty easy check fold on this board. There's no reason to really continue on that board. There's not many great turns. We're out of position with a weak hand, so. Force on the left. We get a fold. 9-5 on the right. So this early stages of both match, as I said, we're just trying to feel our opponent out and trying to get a feel for their tendencies. No interesting spots have really come up just yet. I think we've got our first spot coming up here on the right-hand table. So we get Queen 10, and we get 3-bet. I'm pretty sure this is the second time we've been 3-bet on this right-hand table. I don't mind flatting with this type of hand when we're 75 big blind steep. I think it's, as long as you're not going to be stacking off when you just flop top pair, when the flop comes like 10, 8, 4 or something like that, and you're not just going to freely stack off when you get tons of action on that flop in a 3-bet pot. And as long as you know how to play effectively when you flop hands like middle pair, and you're going to have to revert to some things like pot control. As I'll go ahead here, we actually flop really well. So we flop the flush, and this is one of them hands which is basically just going to play himself. Now, the big decision here was basically, do I flat, given how strong our flush actually is on this board, do I just flat this flop lead, or do I just go ahead and raise? And I decided to just go ahead and raise, and I do this in, well, I'd say 95% of the time, unless our opponent has a tendency to just barrel off. And in this case, I don't actually have them reads. So without reads, I'm always going to raise here and try to get the money in. He has 3-bet pre-flop, so obviously his hand range is weighted a little bit stronger, even though when we don't have a solid idea on his 3-betting range, because it could be super wide in this case. But typically an unknown, we have to assume that his 3-betting range is relatively strong. We want to get it in here. We want to raise this flop because if he has a flush draw, quite often he's going to get it in anyway. And I mean, we do have a couple of blockers on the flush draws, so the nut flush draw and the jack high flush draw maybe are going to get it in here. So we get it in against all his flush draw hands, or most of his flush draw hands. All his pair plus flush draws, obviously. And hands like King X, and even like Queens and Jacks and hands like that, are going to come up with excuses in this situation to get it in on this flop. to protect their hand. Whereas if we just flat here and we take a turn, if we get a blank turn, then a lot of them flush draws aren't going to be necessarily happy to get it in at that point. And if it comes off with another club, then a lot of our hands, a lot of his hands that don't have flush draws, like King Queen or King Jack, etc., are essentially going to have to fold. So we just want to get, this is our straight of value here, and we want to go ahead and get as many chips in the pot as we possibly can at this point in time. I choose to raise relatively small to give him that opportunity to shove and show that he has fold equity. And as it turns out, he had a set, so there's not much that he can do. It's just one of them hands that plays itself at the end of the day. But moving on. So flop top pair over here on the left, he check calls, and we get a really good turn here. I'm always betting here because of the texture here. Basically, this flop is decently wet. A lot of his pre-flop flatting hands are going to hit this board. And obviously, this is another situation where we're going to be happy to get it in on this turn, should he check raise. Well, yeah, I'm not folding basically if he check raises here. I'm not going to be 3-bet shoving if he check raises us here, but I will be calling. Let's move forward. He flats again. Now, on the river, basically all the draws missed. We want to get value here out of his 9x hands and his 6x hands, perhaps using it as an excuse that all the draws missed and we could have been barreling draws. The thing is, I don't really see that many better Jack X hands in his range. He's been relatively aggressive so far, so I don't really see him not raising us on a board texture like this when he does have better Jack X hands. So I think it's a pretty safe river to barrel here and try to get 3 straights of value. So I choose to bet about 360, which is just over half the pot, and we do get called. You're going to have to excuse me if I make mistakes here because I don't remember 100% all of these matches and what actually went on. So it's actually pretty good for me to actually go back and review my own play in some spots and see what I could have done better, because I'm sure I do, particularly in this left-hand game, make some pretty significant mistakes as we go through the matches. King Queen, I'm going to give him another 3-bet here. I think this is my 3rd 3-bet and he flats. With stacks the way they are here, I really don't think, and on a board like this, if we bet here, we bet around about 270 is pretty standard for me on a flop like this. We've got about, we're going to have basically half his stack in the pot. And with 2 overcards here, if we bet, I'm going to have to bet call. I don't think bet folding is very good at all. If we check here, I can check fold and not lose any more money, with the opportunity of him actually checking behind in this situation, which is, oh God, what am I doing? Which is what I actually chose to do. I actually chose to go forward. I think he's shoving on us a ton, and I don't think we fare all that well against his shoving range on this board. I think he's shoving a lot of overcards, some which we beat, a lot of ace-high hands, any pocket pair basically is calling a shove there. So I think it's a little, I think it's close, but I think it can be spew by bet folding there. Well, I think it's pretty bad to bet fold there. So, and bet calling there is arguably spew as well. So I elected to check fold on that board. By checking in the first place, we give him the chance to check back and get free cards. So if you have any comments on that hand, feel free, because I'm still kind of, when I look at that hand now, because typically I like to take the lead. Once I'm the 3-better, I like to basically lead. because a lot of our hand range that we're trying to represent there are obviously overpairs, which makes it difficult for him. But in saying that, this guy's shown to be relatively aggressive, and I think we're getting shoved on way too much. So we flop top pair on the left, which we're just going to c-bet, obviously, and we get check raised. This is the first time I'm pretty sure that he's check raised us here on the left. And on a board which is relatively dry, I don't really see a ton of worse hands that are check raising for value here. In fact, there's hardly any worse hands which are check raising for value. There's obviously hands which are check raising as a bluff here, and some hands which are check raising as a semi bluff. I like to peel one straight here and give him the opportunity to shut down his bluffs. But when he fires it, if he does go ahead and fire a turn here, I'm giving up a pretty large percentage of the time. Stacks are still deep, so I still think we're deep enough to actually be able to do this. So raising in this situation would be pretty bad. Because we're only getting it in versus better hands or hands with pretty decent equity anyway. So I elect to just go ahead and call in this spot, I hope, and see a turn. The turn rolls off with a 7, and he does shut down. And if he was to check this, I'm not sure what he does here. Okay, so he leads this river here. Once he checks the turn, I think that all of the value hands in his range are going to fire the turn. And that's sort of basically on the flop. The reason I'm peeling the flop bet is I think that he shuts down a ton of his bluffs. And I think that he's going to go ahead and barrel all his value hands. When he checks the turn, I think that it's more often than not bluffs in his range or semi-bluffs in his range. For draws, basically the 7 on the turn is a bad card. So I'm always checking it back here. There's no reason for me to go ahead and bet because I hate my life if he check shoves on me, and I'm going to have to bet fold basically. So I check back the turn, and the river rolls off with an ace. It's a pretty good card for him to represent here because some of his bluffing range on that flop is going to consist of ace-x hands. But all of the draws have missed on this board. He really hasn't represented all that much in this spot. Now, a lot of them 9x hands, which were better than ours on the flop as well, we actually chop with as well now. And I don't love calling for a chop, but basically we caught up to all of them hands, so we're not all that concerned. The only hand we're concerned about is ace-9, basically. On top of that, we're calling 390 into a pot of 1,090, so we're getting over 2.5 to 1. I think 2.5. Yeah, 2.5 to 1. I think this is a pretty standard call, given that he's not representing a very wide range at all. His range here is relatively well. It's basically polarized to the nuts, being 9s, 7x. And I highly doubt that even overpairs in this situation are leading this ace river. So I hope I go ahead and call. And he had one of them draws. So on the right here, we go ahead and just donk lead with top pair and a gut shot. So the ace-8 of clubs here on the right, I peel. And this is the same guy that we played with the queen 10. With the queen 10, when he flopped on the, I think it was a king 6x flop, 3 clubs, and he bet small with his set on that flop. This again is a pretty drawy board for him, and he goes ahead and overshoves here. If you're not going to get it in on this flop, when you peel a 3-bet with ace-8 of clubs, then basically, well, when you have the read that I do, then essentially you shouldn't even be flatting with the ace-8 pre-flop. I think sometimes here he has overpairs, but a lot of the time, if he does have overpairs, I don't expect him to make this overshove. Typically, overshoves in spots like this, given that we've seen him bet small with a set on a really wet board, I think this is missed overs just an absolute ton of the time, which it ends up being. I'm not sure if we hold. No, we don't. So that's fine. Oh, maybe we did. No. I have no idea what happened then. Hold on. Oh, yeah. No, we didn't. So that's fine. They're the kind of things that happen. You just have to follow your read and get it in when the opportunity arises to get it in good, basically. The A7 on the left, we get a really wet flop. Stacks are relatively short here. If you notice, they're less than, well, they're just over 20 big blinds deep. I don't really love c-betting wet flops in situations like that. Flooding the Jack 10, and I'll be check folding that flop. And what you can see here is that given that his stack is around about the 25 big blind mark, I've gone to min raising rather than making my standard 2.5x raise in this situation. I think it gives us more control over the match, and we're not raise folding, particularly like if you have a look at this, we're raise folding here. I think saving the 30 chips or the 20 chips in the long run, evens out to a fair bit of money. Ace-3 I flattered. I probably could have 3-bet shoved in that situation. Oh, I think he was a little bit on the deeper side. He might have been towards 30 big blinds, actually. But I don't really see on a board like this when we flop bottom pair. Given that he's been relatively aggressive, I don't really think there's not many good turn or river cards for us in this situation. So we're going to be, if we do float here, we're going to be facing bets on later streets a lot of the time. It's not a great situation to be calling that flop with. So we have another guy here on the right. 8-3's a fold. 10-5, we're going to open it up. Being so early in the match, we're going to be open any two cards and just see how our opponent responds. On the left, I've gone back to 2.5x, and we get 3-bet again. This guy's 3-betting a ton. So when we face an opponent that is 3-betting a ton, which you are going to come across in the mid stakes, you have to start opening up your 4-bet shoving range. You have to, I think, peeling things. I had a discussion the other day with a friend of mine about peeling with hands like suited connectors against chronic 3-betters. And I think you can get into a situation, particularly in heads up sit and goes, where you can't consistently reload, where you can leak a lot of chips by flatting 3-bets with suited connectors and hands like that, because you're not going to hit a whole heap of the time. So I think the best thing to do against people who are 3-betting an absolute ton, as this guy is first of all, open up your 4-bet shoving range. I don't mind to start limping a little bit. I reduce my raise size. We'll just pause it here. I reduce my raise size, so sometimes I revert back to a min raise. And even limping them suited connected type hands gives you a little bit more control of the match when you're in position, because the whole thing with a chronic 3-better is that they're taking the lead away from you a lot of the time by making that 3-bet. So they're actually putting you in more tough spots when you're in position, and they're out of position than you would obviously like, because you want to be in control of the match, obviously. So opening your 4-betting range, limping or raising smaller on the button, I think can be the first steps in controlling a chronic 3-better. In this situation on the left-hand side here, he opens and I go ahead and 3-bet the king queen, and I think I snap called the shove because, okay, so we're 40 big blinds deep or 45 big blinds deep in this situation. I'm putting in 10 big blinds, so about quarter the effective stacks. Once I have that many chips in the pot, I just don't like folding when he ships. Even though our hand is in great shape against his 4-bet shoving range, well, against this guy, the reason I actually called was that he's been so aggressive, and he has seemed to like to have control of the match at every single street, and has been 3-betting me a ton. I think the 4-bet may have been reactional rather than all that well thought out. But as you see, he actually flips ace-10. I think he made a relatively good judgment that I would be calling a little bit wider in this situation. And I'm pretty sure he holds in this situation. Yeah, he does. So I don't necessarily think it's great, but I don't think that you should necessarily be 3-betting in that situation if you're actually going to fold to a shove. Just reverse it up a little bit here. Because on the right-hand table here, we have ace-king. It's 7 hands into the match. We raise, he flats. We get a board which is, middle cards. I suppose it hits a reasonable percentage of his range. Given that this is the first time he's done this and it's so early in the match, I like to go ahead and raise in this situation. We have 2 overcards, and I just want to find out what it means, basically. Some people can argue that this is an expensive way to find out what this donk lead actually means. But in my experience, this lead, the raise of the lead is going to take this pot down a huge percentage of the time. And we're going to be able to play it pretty safely on later streets anyway. And as it is, we actually get a fold. It's just something that I like to do early on in the match. I think it's highly profitable to find out what that donk lead means early on and taking a mental note or an actual note on it. On the left, we get it in. Pretty standard in that spot. On the right, we got a good board to c-bet. And on the left, we flop the world. Now, on the right here, basically when he check calls this flop, we have a backdoor flush draw. We have an overcard. I think we get floated a decent percentage of the time by overcards and things like that. This turn here, it can be argued that it's a decent turn, but I don't really think that all that much. Well, flush draws that floated may fold this turn, but basically we're turning our hand into a bluff in that situation. Now that we get to the turn and we do get that turn and we have ace high, we have some pretty decent showdown value in this spot. So I don't mind actually checking back the turn here and having a look at the river and seeing what our opponent does on the river. When he leads this river, I think it's 10x a pretty decent percentage of the time, and the rest of the time I think that he's basically full of shit. So I hope that I go ahead and call in this spot. No, don't fold. Don't fold. Oh, God. Nit. I think that was a call. The whole reason why I checked back the turn was essentially that I had showdown value and I wanted to steer my hand to showdown. He didn't make it that expensive for us on the river. His range is super polarized there to random trash and bluffs there, basically. and 10x. So I don't love that I folded there on the river. On the right hand table, on the left hand table, sorry, there's lots going on at the moment. I'll just back it up here. Probably shouldn't do this. We flat the flop here. Basically, we have a monster. I don't really want to blow him away. I think that we're, to a degree, as much as I don't love this term, underrepresenting our hand up until this point. I think that he expects, given how the match dynamics have been so far, given how aggressive our game has been so far, I think he would expect us to be raising big flush draws and top pair type hands. We have a hand here which there's going to be basically no scare cards for us on later streets, and we're still going to be happy to get it in on later streets. So I don't mind flatting the flop. We turn the king high flush here on the turn. And as much as I could go ahead and raise here for value, which is actually probably the best thing to do, I don't know if we get all that much value given our stack here out of worse hands, because we're showing him essentially that on the turn, if we raise there, then we've basically committed ourselves. So he has to have a hand that's happy to stack off. And in saying he has to have a hand that's happy to stack off, I think he has to have the 10 of spades or better here. So there's basically only 3 cards he can have here, which I think are happy to stack off. Whereas if we actually go to the river, as I mentioned, I think that we're representing a much weaker hand strength, and I think he's more likely to fire another barrel here than he would have been to actually call a raise or get it in on the turn. Obviously, if he has the ace of spades here, we're getting it in either way. So I don't think we lose. Them hands which have us beat, well, they have us beat. If he has 7-9 of spades here, he has us beat. I'm not folding in any circumstances here. So what we had to think about in this situation was what was our best way to get value. And in this situation, I think the best way for us to get value was to actually try to get him to fire 3 barrels and then try to get it in on the river, which is hopefully what I did. Please shove. Alright, so we do actually go ahead and shove in this spot. Don't know if he calls there. And he calls. So as I mentioned, I think, so he had 10-7 of spades. I don't know if it was all that great on his behalf, because I don't know if we're ever shoving. Well, I'm never shoving anything worse than the king of spades in that spot. So it was a pretty bad call on his behalf, but that was the hand range that we're looking to get value out of. So king 10, c-bet, pretty good board to c-bet. King 5 suited on the right hand table, check it away. Flop top pair, and we're just going to lead here. And once again we get a pretty good turn, so we're just going to try to barrel and get as much in as we possibly can here. Now this is a pretty similar situation to the one I spoke about a little bit earlier, where I actually checked the river, given that a lot of the draws missed. In this spot, there's really not any draws. The board was really dry, so I think more often than not in this situation, he has pair hands, 1 pair hands. And I want to get value out of them hands, because we're giving like 8x an opportunity or 9x an opportunity to check back here. Some, Jack 10 backdoored here, which is no concern, because we're actually bet folding here, and it's a pretty clear bet fold. If he does have better king x's, if he has 2 pairs, he would be raising this river, and this is probably the line that he would actually take in them circumstances. So hopefully I don't be a nit like I was a second ago with that ace high hand, and I do go ahead and fire a 3rd barrel in this spot, because I definitely think we get value out of worse hands. But he folds. And, given the way that match has gone so far, I think that that guy in particular is actually checking back a decent portion of his one pair hands there, so we're not actually getting value out of them one way or the other if he folds in there. In this spot, he min 3-bet us. We peeled with 4s, which is pretty standard, and it's a pretty easy fold when you see bets there. The ace-4 on the left with 25 BBs effective. I shove that all day long. Particularly in an aggressive match, my shoving ranges are going to be particularly wide. And as you'll see as this match goes on, because we actually do get this match goes on for a fair while on the left-hand table here, there is a fair shoving dynamic that we go through. Flatting the Queen 9. Now, I don't love flatting the Queen 9. Given that we're only 25 big blinds effective. I don't think it's horrible, but I don't know if we hit enough flops to actually make it a profitable call pre-flop when he 3x's it. On top of that, I think that some of the time we do flop decent hands, I think we get it in dominated. Given that, I do say get it in, because if we do flop a piece such as top pair, as we have done here, I'm 100% getting it in with these stack sizes. And if I'm not happy to get it in with these stack sizes, then there's no point in appealing in the first place. And we get it in against Jack 10. I think that just shows basically how loose this guy is. He's definitely a lag, and we've seen that throughout the course of the match so far. And the King Jack's a snap call. For 20 big blinds, when he 3-bet shoves there after the hand beforehand, it's a snap call. It's really standard, and we lose again. All right. So I think it's taken me a ton of time to get through the first 14 minutes of footage because I'm reversing and things like that. So I better get a move on. On the left-hand table here, we flop a really, this is a really pretty hand for us. We flop bottom pair and a flush draw. I think a lot of people get overexcited in situations like this, and they're just fist pump getting it in on flops like this. If I was to get check raised here, I'm obviously getting it in, but our actual equity against a lot of the hands, we're behind basically when we're getting it in. Unless we get it in versus worse flush draws, I think every time that we get it in on this flop, we get it in behind. And that's even against this guy. And given that this guy showed us that he was happy to stack off with middle pair in the Queen 9 hand, I think that he's definitely capable of check raising a queen here. So I don't necessarily want to just go ahead and try to get all the chips in on this flop. Even though it wouldn't be all that horrible, I think I can get it in with better equity, and I can make better informed decisions if I do check it back. On top of that, given how aggressive this match has been so far, I think checking it back really makes our range look a lot weaker than what it is. I think that he would expect that if we did flop a hand as strong as what our hand is here, that we would be c-betting here, given that we've c-bet a ton. So if a spade was to roll off here, I think that we have a decent chance of actually getting it in, and him actually not putting us on a flush in this situation. The turn's a total brick, and in this spot, I'm actually just going to flat now. The reason I'm going to flat is basically for the same reason why we weren't all that happy to get it in on the flop. If I raise here, we have even worse equity now with only one card to come. So I think it's a pretty easy flat behind if you do take this line of actually flatting behind on this flop. We get there in the end. As I said, I don't think that he's necessarily going to put us on a flush in a lot of situations like this. It's just a matter of deciding the best bet size to make here on the river. In a spot like this, I think his range is particularly weak. The line that he's taken is... Oh, God, no, what did I do? Whoops. Yeah, I think that the line that he's actually taken, the check flop, bet turn, check river, is pretty weak on his behalf. In saying that, I think that our hand range in his mind is also going to be relatively weak. Even though the most obvious draw rolled off here on the river, I do believe that if he's going to call here on the river, he's going to call. So a shove in this situation, an over shove, is pretty big, and I think that it gets more folds than what betting 650 or 700 would. Over betting the pot in this spot, even though we're betting over half our stack, I think it gets called by the same hand range that betting like 320 does in this spot. Given the line that we've taken, if he is going to call us here, I think that he's going to call us one way or the other. I don't think he'll call an overshove, but I think he'll call an overbet. And in this spot, I think I already saw it, and I'm sure you guys already saw it, but me and clicking buttons the wrong way resulted in me messing around with it. And I think I bet 625 in this spot. And it's for exactly that reason. I think that the amount of flush draws in our range here, in his mind, is not going to be a huge amount. And I think we get called by the same range that we do if we bet 300. And he had King Jack. So I was wrong in my assumption that his hand range was weaker. In fact, his hand range was actually stronger. So we may have actually got called by... Had we overshoved, we may have actually got called there. But we can't just think about this situation. We need to think about if he had like a naked King X or a naked Queen X in that spot. So the Queen 10. Okay. So he's still 3xing here on the left when we're 20 big blinds deep, which is pretty bad. The good thing that he's done here is he's shown us basically his willingness to get it in. So I don't think we can 3-bet shove as wide as what we could. Well, we can 3-bet shove wider for value, but I don't think we can necessarily 3-bet shove any two cards like we can against some people when they 3x. He, on the other hand, has decided to abuse the hell out of us and start 3-bet shoving on us a ton. So I don't know if I think I made a pretty slow adjustment here on the left-hand table. I probably should have reacted a lot quicker than what I did, because essentially he's come back from around about 700 chips to around about 1200 chips just by 3-bet shoving. And I really should have made an adjustment a little bit earlier. Now I can 3-bet shove this hand for value, given how the match has gone. Not 100% sure what happened there on the right-hand table. I think we got it in with top pair on a paired board against an under pair. So the Queen 6, I did go ahead and limp, and this is the adjustment that I spoke about earlier, where I said if someone's just 3-betting you chronically, one of your best adjustments is to start limping, to raise smaller, and to widen your 4-bet shoving range, which is what I'm going to do in this spot, or in this case, given that the stacks are shorter and he's 3-bet shoving, I need to widen my calling range, which I do, and we run into a legitimate hand in this spot, and he holds. So there's a lot of back and forth in this match, but you have to understand that even though there's a lot of back and forth and the stack sizes are changing constantly in the weight one way or the other, that is that he's had the chip lead, then I've had the chip lead, and then so on and so forth. I think that you have to remember that we are worried about effective stacks rather than... What the hell am I doing here on the left? that it's about effective stacks. So if there's a 3-bet shove dynamic and that's the way that it's been going with 20 big blind effective stacks, then that's the way it's likely to keep going if the stacks remain that way. I don't know what the fuck I was doing there in that hand with the king 6. I have no idea what I was doing there. Please berate me. Yeah, we're just gonna forget about it. All right. So now I'm down to around about 10 big blinds on the left. He doubled with 9 deuce, I think, over here on the right in a pretty standard pre-flop situation. Standard on our behalf, getting it in. I think the stacks were like 10 big blinds, and we got it in. He called with 9-4, which is pretty standard at these levels. And that's what I'm talking about when I say that you have to start learning to deal with the variance. In the mid stakes, this is where most of our money comes from, is people just being somewhat retarded. Get that given, you're going to cop a lot more beats than what you do in the lower stakes. Not that they're not that bad in the lower stakes, but when you start playing for more money, it's going to start affecting you in different ways. And with people doing things like that, like calling it off with like 9 deuce and 9-4 and things like that, and getting there on you, you just have to shrug your shoulders and just shake it off. Basically, at the end of the day, this hand here, I'm just going to rewind it because I was blabbering again. On the right, the Jack 10 hand, the stacks are around 35 big blinds. He raises, I flat. I think we're deep enough to flat here. Pretty standard check call on this flop with middle pair and a gut shot. So I am going to go ahead and check call in this spot, given how often people see bet. The turn isn't a great one for us. If he barreled this turn card, I'd be folding. But given that he actually checks back the turn, what I like to do here on the river is to put out a blocking bet. This bet can be, as much as I don't love blocking bets, and I think Noah SD, when he was working for Poker Savvy, did a good video on why blocking bets actually suck. And to a degree they do, but in situations like this one here, given our opponent, at the time I really felt like we can get value. So I can value bet really small here. But in saying that, I think that we lose a lot less because I also think that he calls with like, if we bet like 90 here, I think he calls with King X, 9X, Jack X. Occasionally even with like hands like 8s and 7s and things like that. I think that the odds are just too juicy for him to fold. In saying that, when he does have King X here, or he does have, he may raise Ace X here, but I think that by actually betting ourselves here, it prevents us from facing a standard size bet here, because if we were to check here, I think quite often he bets his King X hands here and he bets like 270 or 280, 300. This way, it's a very easy bet fold. I think we get some value out of worse hands, and I think that we save ourselves a ton of value against better hands. So that's basically the purpose of this bet. And in the end, he actually folds, so which is also a decent result for us. The left Ace-7 suited is a pretty easy shove. He seems to think it's funny there on the right. I'm not sure why. I wouldn't think it was all that funny. Queen 9 on the left, unfortunately we have to fold. That's me getting trapped again by this 3-bet shoving war that's going on here. Probably should limp hands like that if you're not happy to actually call them off, but they are hands which flop decently well. It's probably a good candidate to limp. And I raise pre-flop there and fold on a reasonably wet texture. Checking back here on the right, don't see a great deal of value for us, given that we have showdown value in that spot. It's a pretty wet texture for us to see bet, which I don't love. Raising on the left, snap calling a shove. And that's what you need to start thinking about when you get in situations like this is, can I snap call a shove, basically? And if the answer is no, but you still want to see a flop with your hand, God, what am I doing again? But you do want to actually see a flop with your hand, I think it's best to actually limp, particularly when stacks are as they are, they're in the relatively short range where we are, the 25 big blinds effective around there. If you're raising, I think you should be raising to raise call against chronic 3-bet as this is. If you're limping, your hands that flop decently well. I don't think a lot of people are good enough basically to exploit that type of strategy in these levels. So I check raise this flop on the left here. It's a pretty decent flop to check raise. The board's pretty dry. The turn card, I expect basically that if he has King X on this flop, given how the match has gone so far, that he's shoving the flop every time. The only, given that the flush draw is there as well, I really don't think that there's any hands that he flats the check raise with here that are super strong. So I'm always going to go ahead and fire a turn like this one. I think we get a ton of folds. Probably best in this situation that I hadn't check raised him a ton. I think that our hand range becomes a lot stronger to him, so worked out for us this time. I would have looked stupid if he rolled King X. He shoved on me and rolled King X or something like that. We did have a gut shot as well. So left, easy shove. The right, played it like a spastic and got what I deserved, I think. Might actually have the best hand. Yeah. So I still play that hand terribly. I have to bet the flop in that situation. Flopping top two. Should have raised pre-flop for starters. And then definitely should have been leading that flop. Might be having a little chat war with him there. Ace-Jack versus Ace-10 on the left. Very standard. Given the match dynamics, very, very, very standard. Ace on the right, wanting him to shove. He doesn't oblige. Jack 2 on the left. One of the things that can be relatively frustrating playing against someone such as the guy that we're playing on the left, who's really aggressive, particularly pre-flop, and particularly with short effective stacks, it can become frustrating when you go card dead, because basically you can't raise, you can't even limp in them spots when they get down to around the 10 big blind mark. You can't even limp because they're going to shove anyway. And sometimes you just go through patches where you just don't get any hands which you could call a shove with. You need to be patient. Don't worry too much about the fact that their stack is increasing at a decently steady rate. And just hang in there and try to get yourself in a plus EV situation as best that you possibly can. Queen 4, I limp on the left. I flat the flop. I don't love my flat here. I think I either have to raise, and raising I'm not representing anything basically, or just fold it, which is obviously the best option on a flop like that. 6-9 of spades on a king 9 flop. I'm definitely happy to get it in. What the hell am I doing? Probably should just be raising that flop and trying to get it in. As played, I let him barrel. Probably got more value than I would have by check shoving that flop. And now I actually think about it, I don't think that it's that terrible, because every 9x hand is better than ours, and obviously King X crushes us. So maybe not as bad as what I actually made it out to be, but still, I mean, I'd be happy to get it in on that flop. given the stack sizes, is what I'm trying to say. God, I'm rambling a ton. King 5 suited, I should be willing to get that in, which I do. Ace 5 on the right, get there. And I do get there, happy days. And I also flop the world on the right hand table as well. Pretty standard spot to actually go ahead and raise here. This is similar to the situation earlier where I flopped the Jack, Queen, King flop and I flopped the flush draw and bottom pair. In this situation though, any hand that we do get it in on, against on this flop, we're basically very, very happy to get it in against. If a heart was to roll off here, and we did flat this flop, I think it's relatively obvious against this guy that we flopped that we had a flush draw. Well, I think that this guy isn't thinking at the same level that the other guy is. Therefore, we're better off trying to get value on this straight rather than waiting to later straights. On top of that, our equity can significantly take bumps on later straights if we get really bad turn and river cards, for example. So this is our straight here. Given that he's not really thinking on a high level, and I do expect that sometimes he even calls a raise here with 9x, I think our best way to go about it is to just raise this flop, which is what we did, and he folded. So Jack 4. This is pretty boring now. We're down to one table. A second ago, I couldn't handle the pace that it was going at, and now I'm sitting here with nothing to say while we wait for action. So basically, this match on the left here, this guy's talked a ton of garbage here in the chat box. I think I'm not here to talk about chat box wars, but you're probably best to stay out of it a lot of the time, I think. As fun as it can be. So we're playing with 20 BBs effective. Even though he's talk trash about shoving and bluffing and all that kind of thing, don't really think that he's doing it all that wide. I need to see that for myself before I start making assumptions like that, regardless of what he's actually saying in the chat box. But I think he starts shoving with a heaps higher frequency, and if he does do that, his range obviously widens. I think this is a snap call if he shoves the ace-3. King 3 suited, probably folding if he open shoves here. Probably folding even if he raises. Probably wouldn't have been all that bad a hand to shove there. The ace-3, once again, I'm pretty sure I'm snap calling a shove here. Get a pretty wet texture. With ace high here, always checking it back. The turn's a pretty disgusting one, and it's pretty easy fold when he does that. Not sure if I load up another game or not here. I might just finish this match off. And that will be the end of the video. 3-5 is a pretty easy check. So essentially, I think we've had a fair few different types of players. Even though we've only played, I think, 4 or 5 matches in this video, I think we've got a decent feel for what the type of play is as you come into the mid stakes. And as you can see, the guy that I played on the other table, the match that went for a fair while, I can't remember what his screen name is now, but is a pretty good example of a laggy fish that you're going to come across in the mid stakes. I don't think he was completely horrible in saying that. I didn't shark scope him or anything like that, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was a slightly winning player at these levels. And they're the type of players, the recreational type players, that you're going to come across in the mid stakes that have a decent idea of what they're doing, and you're going to have to learn to start to deal with them and start to make appropriate adjustments to what they're doing, as we had to do against that guy, and as I probably wasn't all that fast in doing. It's a terrible flap by me pre-flop there with Queen 10. I need to just ship it or fold it pre-flop with these stack sizes. I think he thinks he was bluffing me, but he was bluffing with the best hand, so. Alright, and this is another thing that you're going to encounter, just utterly silly, I'll say silly, things that go on at the tables by some people. And you just going, as I said before, you just have to be patient, particularly with people like this, because they are going to hang themselves. They are going to make massive mistakes, and you just need to be there ready to pounce when they do make that massive mistake, when you do have that hand, and not get too frustrated with it by them, particularly when they start getting a chip lead on you or something like that. You got to try your best to not be frustrated by it, and to stay as calm and as focused as you possibly can, and keep making the best EV decisions that you possibly can. It's really easy to get carried away and start snapping, sorry, and start snapping off like 25 BB open shoves with like King 6 suited and King 4 suited and hands like that. But it's not the best way to do it. They're going against players who make massive mistakes, as this guy is. You really need to just hold your nerve and wait for the best spot to actually get it in. So the 3-5. On top of that, I haven't really been attacking all that many pots out of position as I was early in the match, purely based on the fact that this guy is just doing some crazy things. I don't know what he's going to do if I lead. So my best plan of attack is to just wait until I have some kind of hand value. Pretty easy value bet when all three straights have been checked there. I don't think there's any different way that I could play that hand there, given the frequency in which he's been an aggro tard in this spot. So middle pair here. And he checks back, which is quite strange. And quite often when they do something different, I start to get a little bit suspicious. In this spot, I think betting's fine, and we get a really good river in this situation. So, given how aggressive he'd been on flops, like over betting and things like that, and always betting the flops, when he does go ahead and checks back a flop, it kind of makes me awfully suspicious, even though we have middle pair in this spot. But in saying that as well, given how aggressive he had been, I think that he is smart enough to use that to his advantage when he does flop a hand like top pair. So I do go ahead and bet the turn. He flats. Makes me a little bit more concerned, I think. But given that we get a great river card there, obviously making less tens in the deck for him to have, I think that was a pretty easy bet there on the river for value. And we get it in flipping here when he 3-bet shoves. And run good. So we've kind of covered a little bit in this video relating to last week's video. I think we've also covered a little bit in the adjustments that you need to make in the mid-stakes games. But overall, I hope that you guys have got a decent perspective on what the style of play is in the mid-stakes to a large degree, because these type of players are the players that you're going to encounter day in, day out, obviously. And I think that they're a pretty different breed to the players playing really low stakes. In a lot of cases in the low stakes, you're going to come across a lot nittier players. It definitely gets more aggressive as you start moving up through the mid stakes. I think that I've rambled enough for this video. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the forum. If you want to berate me for anything that you've seen, like that raise that I made with King 6, also feel free to do that. Next week I'm going to be back with a video playing against some really good heads up sit and go regs, which should be nice and interesting for you guys. Good luck at the tables, everyone, and I will be speaking to you soon. Peace.